Imagine you are a politician. You just signed a massive $2 trillion infrastructure and stimulus bill.
Oh, the classic scenario.
Right. So you stood at the podium. You promised your constituents this was going to, supercharge the economy, save millions of jobs, completely turn things around. And then a year goes by.
And nothing really happens.
Exactly. You look at the data, and private businesses are still struggling. The growth is just incredibly flat. The impact feels totally muted. And you are left wondering, where on earth did all that money go?
Is a phenomenal question. And I mean, it happens all the time in the real world. People look at these massive government packages and wonder if the money just vanished into thin air.
Or if some economist somewhere just did the math wrong.
Right. But the reality is far more systemic. It is not a math error. It is a mechanical reaction.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we are going on a deep dive into exactly why those trillion-dollar promises sometimes fall completely flat.
Yeah, we are looking at a set of economics notes covering what is known as the ISLM framework.
But really, our mission today for you listening is to look under the hood of the economy. We are going to uncover the invisible mechanics. This ultimate silent tug of war happening behind the scenes between the real economy of everyday goods and the financial side of money and interest rates.
And that tug of war dictates almost everything about our daily financial lives. So before we can even begin to understand why those stimulus packages misfire, we first need to isolate the two main engines of the economy.
Right. You can't just look at the whole chaotic machine at once. You have to break it down.
Exactly. We have the goods market and we have the money market.
So let's start with the goods market, the real economy. The fundamental rule here is really all about finding a balance, right?
Yeah. In the goods market, the economy is stable when total output perfectly equals total demand.
And output is literally everything we produce, from cars to haircuts to, commercial ovens.
Right, everything. And that total demand is driven by three distinct groups of people buying things. First, you have consumption.
That's just us, right?
Yeah, think about your own checking account right now. Buying groceries, paying for a streaming service, everyday household spending. Second, you have government spending. Building roads, funding schools.
But the third piece is the real wild card here. Investment.
Yes. And in this context, we aren't talking about, buying stocks or bonds. We mean businesses buying physical machinery or building new factories.
And that investment piece is the critical behavioral link in this whole engine. Because whether a business decides to invest depends heavily on the cost of borrowing money.
It's the hurdle rate.
Exactly, the hurdle rate. Let's use an analogy. Imagine you run a bakery and you are deciding whether to take out a loan to buy a massive new commercial oven.
Okay, I like this.
If the bank's interest rate is sitting at a sky-high 10%, your new oven has to generate a massive amount of extra pastries just to clear that hurdle and pay back the expensive loan.
Precisely. High borrowing costs just choke off investment. It is a direct behavioral seesaw. As the cost of borrowing rises, the appetite for building new factories or buying new ovens drops.
But let's flip it and trace the chain reaction when rates fall.
Right. If the interest rate drops to, say, 2%, suddenly that hurdle is much lower. A whole bunch of new business projects suddenly look incredibly profitable.
So the bakery buys the oven, investment rises.
Yes, and it doesn't stop at the bakery's door. When investment rises, the total demand for all those manufacturing materials and delivery workers rises too.
Which means total output across the economy has to rise to meet that demand. This is the IS curve derivation, right? Interest rates drop, investment goes up, aggregate demand goes up, so output goes up.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting because the effects ripple out.
The multiplier effect.
Right. If I am the worker who just got hired to build that commercial oven, I am taking my very first paycheck, and I'm finally going out to buy that new television I've been wanting.
So the bakery's investment becomes the electronics store's revenue.
Yes. Higher output means higher disposable income, which drives everyday consumption up, reinforcing the whole cycle.
It creates a powerful snowball effect. So to summarize the real economy, lower borrowing costs lead to higher overall output. They balance each other out.
But as we mentioned, that is only half the economy. That is just the goods market. The other engine running in parallel, in the exact same car, is the money market.
And the rules over here are completely different.
Completely different, because over in the money market, the actual supply of cash floating around the system isn't determined by businesses or consumers.
It's completely fixed. It's dictated by the central bank. They decide how many dollars exist.
Right, the supply is locked, so all the behavioral action happens on the demand side. How much of that cash do people actually want to hold in their wallets or checking accounts?
According to our sources, that demand relies on two main factors. The first is transaction demand, which is honestly highly intuitive.
Yeah, if the economy is booming and output is high, you are making more purchases. You literally need more cash on hand to make those daily transactions. Higher output equals a higher need for cash.
Makes sense. But the second factor is where things get a bit tricky. It is the opportunity cost of holding that cash.
Right, because keeping money in your checking account feels safe, but cash doesn't pay you anything. Bonds, however, do pay you. They offer a yield.
Exactly. Every dollar you keep in your wallet is a missed opportunity to be earning a yield from a bond. So if interest rates are high, bonds become incredibly attractive.
So people want to hold less cash because they would rather lock their wealth up in those high-yielding bonds.
Okay, let me pause you there, because the sources detail a specific chain reaction here that I want to make sure we really understand. Let's say the economy starts booming. Output rises.
Right.
Because people are doing more business, their transaction demand for money rises. They need cash. But the central bank has fixed the total supply of cash. So suddenly there isn't enough cash to go around. People need liquidity, so what do?
They look at their assets, and they keep selling off their bonds to get that cash.
Right. And if everyone in the economy suddenly needs cash to run their booming businesses, they're all trying to sell their bonds at the exact same time, which means nobody is buying.
Yes. And let's think about the mechanics of that. If you are desperate to sell your bond, but there are no buyers, you have to put it on sale. You have to drop the price of the bond to make it attractive.
So massive selling causes bond prices to plummet. And this is the crucial inverse relationship we have to grasp. Why does the bond price plummeting cause the interest rate to go up?
Let's walk through a micro scenario. Imagine you have a bond that promises to pay out $50 a year. If you bought that bond for $1,000, your yield, your interest rate is 5%.
Right. 50 is 5% of 1,000.
But now you are desperate for cash. You need to sell that bond, but nobody wants it. So you drop the price to $500.
I see. The bond still pays that fixed $50 a year, but now whoever buys it only pays $500 to get it. $50 is 10% of 500.
Exactly. The yield just doubled from 5% to 10%. By dropping the price of the bond, the effective interest rate in the economy shoots up.
So let's connect the whole chain for the money market, the LM curve. Higher economic output means people need more cash.
To get cash, they sell bonds. Selling bonds drives their price down.
And lower bond prices mean higher interest rates. So in the money market, higher output forces interest rates up to keep things balanced.
Okay, so we've got these two distinct behavioral seesaws. In the goods market, lower interest rates encourage businesses to borrow, which boosts output.
But in the money market, that very same booming output drains the cash supply, forcing interest rates right back up.
And here's the catch. These two markets cannot operate in isolation. They share the same economy.
They are forced to share the exact same interest rate and the exact same level of output.
They are forced into a compromise. They are heading for an inevitable collision.
And that collision is what economists call general equilibrium. It is the one specific point, the one level of output and interest rate, where both the goods market and the money market are perfectly balanced at the exact same time.
Neither side is pulling on the rope anymore.
But what happens if the economy wanders off that spot? Let's say something weird happens and the interest rate gets artificially stuck way too high.
Well, the two markets will immediately start fighting. The goods market looks at that sky-high interest rate and says, borrowing is way too expensive, investment is dead, so our output is going to be incredibly low.
But the money market looks at that exact same high rate and says, bonds are paying out a fortune, nobody wants to hold cash, so the only way people would need this much money is if output was incredibly high.
You have a massive contradiction. And the economy hates a contradiction. So it self-corrects.
It acts like a rubber band.
Yeah, because the interest rate is too high, there's basically a surplus of cash in the financial system.
Yeah.
Everyone wants those high-yielding bonds instead. So the interest rate naturally starts to drift downward.
And as the borrowing cost falls, the bakery finally buys that oven, pushing output up.
Meanwhile, as the yield on bonds falls, people stop dumping their cash into the financial markets. The two engines pull each other directly back to that center point. They lock into place.
Wait, so if both markets are in perfect harmony at this equilibrium, does that mean the economy is actually doing well? Like, is the average person thriving?
No.
Yeah.
And that is a stark, crucial reality to understand and a huge misconception. Equilibrium is not a synonym for prosperity.
It just means the math balances.
Exactly. You could have a beautifully balanced general equilibrium right in the middle of a devastating economic depression. You could have millions of people unemployed, factories sitting completely idle, businesses going bankrupt.
Wow.
The economy is perfectly stable. It's just perfectly stable at a very bleak, miserable level of output.
Man, the math balances, but the people are suffering. That brings us right back to our opening scenario with the politician.
Right, because equilibrium can still mean massive unemployment. The government usually looks at that bleak situation, mechanics, and decides they have to step in.
They need to artificially stimulate demand. This is fiscal expansion. Let's walk through exactly how they do that.
So the government decides the economy needs a jolt, so they pass that $2 trillion bill. They start building new highways, bridges, maybe upgrading the national power grid.
This is a direct, massive injection of cash right into the veins of the goods market. The IS curve shifts right. Suddenly, demand is surging because the government is buying so much stuff.
So output rises. The construction workers get hired, they buy the TVs, the multiplier effect kicks in. It sounds like a total success.
But how does the government actually pay for that $2 trillion? They don't just have it sitting in a giant vault.
They have to borrow it. They issue government bonds to the public to raise the cash, and we need to understand exactly what that massive borrowing does to the financial system.
Because this is the trapdoor that dilutes the whole stimulus.
Exactly. The government is spending, so aggregate demand goes up. Factories start producing more steel and concrete for the highways. Output rises.
But remember, the strict rules of the money market. Higher output means people and businesses are making more transactions. They suddenly need more cash to meet payroll and buy supplies.
But the central bank hasn't printed any more money. The total money supply is strictly fixed.
You have a surging demand for cash from both the private sector trying to run their booming businesses and the massive government trying to fund its stimulus, all chasing a fixed, limited supply of dollars.
What happens when demand wildly outstrips supply? The price goes up. And the price of money is the interest rate. This sudden, severe scarcity of cash drives the interest rate higher.
Okay, I think I have an analogy for this. Imagine the total supply of credit and cash in the economy is a local bar.
Okay, I'm tracking.
It's Friday night, everyone is getting drinks. Suddenly the government bursts through the doors. They order top-shelf drinks for everyone in the room to get the party started, and they max out the bartender's tab to do it.
They're taking up all the financial room in the establishment.
Right. And who suffers in that scenario? The regular patrons. A local business owner walks into the bar hoping to get a small line of credit to build that new factory we talked about earlier.
But the bartender says, sorry, the government just drank all our liquidity, and because drinks are so scarce now, the price of a pint just quadrupled.
Exactly. The business owner looks at that sky-high interest rate, realizes the hurdle rate is impossible to clear, and walks right back out without building the factory.
That is exactly what happens. The government has accidentally made it too expensive for businesses to borrow. That chain reaction is known as crowding out.
So government spending rises, output rises, which causes money demand to rise, which forces interest rates to spike, which finally causes private investment to plummet.
The government has literally crowded out private investment.
It's a cruel irony. The politicians stepped in to boost the economy, but by doing so, they inadvertently strangled the local bakery and the local factory.
Now, does this mean the stimulus was completely pointless?
Not entirely, right?
No, not entirely. It is important to note that the fiscal policy still works on some level. Overall output is usually higher than where it started, but the effect is heavily diluted.
It's a partial crowding out.
Right. The politician didn't get the massive economy-saving punch they promised because that painful drop in private business investment canceled out a huge chunk of their government spending.
And there is another crucial nuance here, too, when we talk about fiscal policy. We've been talking about direct government spending, like building bridges. But politicians also love to use tax cuts as a stimulus. How does that compare?
A tax cut is inherently weaker than direct spending, and it really comes down to human behavior. Specifically, something called the marginal propensity to consume.
Let's translate that.
It's essentially a measure of how much of an extra dollar you'll actually spend.
Okay.
If the government spends $1 billion building a bridge, that is $1 billion of guaranteed immediate demand in the economy.
Dollar for dollar.
Exactly. But if the government gives $1 billion back to the public in tax cuts, human beings don't spend all of it. If you get a $1,000 tax refund, you might spend $800 on a new appliance, but you will probably put $200 into your savings account.
And that saved money is a leakage. It doesn't stimulate the goods market, it just sits there.
Because of that saving leakage, tax cuts always pack a smaller punch than direct government spending, even before the crowding out effect happens.
Okay, so if the government's fiscal spending accidentally suffocates the local business owner by jacking up the bar tab, how on earth do we stimulate the economy without triggering that crowding out trapdoor?
We have to turn to the other major player, the central bank. This brings us to monetary expansion.
While the government controls fiscal policy and spending, the central bank controls monetary policy.
And their whole focus is that fixed money supply we keep talking about. When the economy is in a slump, they decide to unfix it. They increase the money supply.
They provide more cash to the bar. How do they actually do that, practically speaking?
They have a few specific tools. They can lower the reserve ratio, meaning commercial banks are legally required to hold less cash locked in their vaults.
Which instantly frees them up to lend more out to the public.
Right. Or they can engage in open market operations. This usually means the central bank goes into the financial markets and buys up government bonds from the public, handing out fresh, newly created cash in return. Or they can purchase foreign exchange.
Whichever tool they use, the result is the same. They flood the financial system with liquidity. So let's trace this mechanism, because it triggers a completely different chain reaction than government spending.
It really does. Let's follow the transmission mechanism. The central bank floods the market with new money. Suddenly, at the current level of economic activity, there is an excess supply of cash.
People and banks have way more cash than they actually need for their daily transactions.
So what do they do with that extra wealth? They don't want it sitting idle, so they try to buy bonds.
And we know this behavioral seesaw. If suddenly everyone has extra cash and they all want to buy bonds, the demand for bonds skyrockets, which drives the price of bonds way up.
Yes. And as we established with our micro scenario earlier, when bond prices go up, the interest rate, the yield, must fall.
So the interest rate plunges, and then that financial signal transmits directly over to the goods market.
Exactly.
The local business owner checks the loan rates at the bank and sees that the hurdle rate has totally collapsed. Borrowing is incredibly cheap. They immediately sign the paperwork to build that new factory. Investment surges, aggregate demand rises, output rises.
What's fascinating here is the stark contrast to the politicians' fiscal expansion. When the government spends, output goes up, but interest rates shoot up with it, painfully squeezing private businesses.
Right.
But when the central bank expands the money supply, output goes up while interest rates go down. Because borrowing costs fall, private investment actively increases.
There is zero crowding out. They completely bypassed the trapdoor. The central bank essentially bought everyone a round of drinks without maxing out the local tab.
Precisely. Monetary policy stimulates the economy by actively encouraging private business expansion rather than stepping on its toes.
Wait, if monetary policy avoids the crowding out trap entirely and actually lowers borrowing costs for everyday people, why don't we just use that all the time? Why do we ever bother with messy, politically charged government spending bills?
That is the ultimate economic question. And the answer is that you cannot just pick your favorite policy in a vacuum. The success or failure of a policy depends entirely on the behavioral terrain of the economy at that exact specific moment in time.
You have to know the shape of the markets.
Yes, the slopes matter enormously.
Let's look at some real-world terrain then. Let's look at scenario A. Imagine the goods market is paralyzed by fear. Businesses are incredibly pessimistic about the future.
In economics, we call this a situation where the IS curve is almost vertical. It means investment is completely insensitive to interest rates.
So you could be the central bank and drop borrowing costs all the way down to absolute zero.
But if the local business owner truly believes a massive recession is coming and nobody will ever buy their products, they still aren't going to take out a loan to build a factory.
So in that scenario, the central bank's elegant monetary policy is completely powerless. Lowering rates does nothing to spur investment.
Exactly. But ironically, in that exact same terrified terrain, government fiscal policy becomes incredibly powerful.
Because if businesses refuse to spend, the government can step in and spend $1 trillion to guarantee demand.
Right. And because private businesses aren't trying to borrow any money anyway, there is no private investment to crowd out. The government has the whole financial bar to itself.
Okay, flip it. Scenario B. What if the roadblock is in the money market? Economists call this a liquidity trap. Think back to the 2008 financial crisis.
A liquidity trap is a central banker's absolute worst nightmare. This happens when the LM curve is flat. Interest rates are already sitting practically at zero, and the public is deeply terrified of the financial markets.
They don't want to hold bonds at all. They just want to hoard raw cash for safety.
So the central bank tries its usual trick. They pump trillions of new dollars into the money supply.
But the transmission mechanism is broken. Because interest rates are already at zero, pumping more money in doesn't lower rates any further.
And because rates don't fall, it doesn't stimulate any new business investment. Output doesn't rise. The new cash just pools up in people's savings accounts. Economists call it pushing on a string.
In a liquidity trap, monetary policy completely loses its power.
But again, in that scenario, massive government fiscal spending works beautifully because the central bank will gladly print whatever money the government needs to spend, preventing any interest rate spikes or crowding out.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the absolute key takeaway from all of this is that these two markets, the goods market and the money market, are completely inseparable.
They're constantly interacting, constantly negotiating. The effectiveness of a policy isn't just about how many billions of dollars are advertised in the politician's headline. It's about whether the real economy and the financial economy are going to fight that policy or amplify it.
This is exactly why those massive stimulus packages sometimes disappoint. Policymakers might be aggressively pulling the wrong lever for the specific behavioral shape of the economy at that exact time.
If they try a massive government spending bill when the money supply is tight, they just trigger massive crowding out, jack up interest rates, and suffocate the local business owner.
But if the central bank tries to blindly print money during a terrified liquidity trap, the cash just pools up in bank vaults and does absolutely nothing.
You have to know the terrain before you choose your tool.
Wow. Okay, let's quickly recap this journey for you because we just covered some serious macroeconomic ground.
We really did.
We started by exploring the engine room of the economy. We looked at the real economy, the goods market, where total output has to meet demand.
And how heavily that relies on businesses clearing that interest rate hurdle to invest.
Right. Then we look at the financial side, the money market, where the strictly fixed supply of cash battles against our daily transaction needs and the allure of buying yielding bonds.
We saw how those two forces collide at general equilibrium, a mathematical compromise that could still leave us stuck in a miserable depression.
And we saw the two distinct ways to fight our way out of that depression. The government can spend directly, but risks taking up all the oxygen in the room, driving up interest rates, and crowding out private business.
Or the central bank can flood the system with money, driving rates down and actively boosting private investment.
Assuming the public isn't paralyzed by a liquidity trap, of course.
Right. It is a constant, delicate negotiation between the goods we produce and the money we use to value them.
So the next time you see headlines about central bank interventions or a new politician at a podium pushing a massive trillion-dollar spending bill, you now know the invisible mechanical tug of war happening behind the scenes.
You know exactly why it might work brilliantly, or why it might just fizzle out.
But I want to leave you with one final lingering thought straight from the source material we've been analyzing today. We have based almost this entire deep dive on that hurdle rate concept.
The behavioral idea that if interest rates drop, businesses will naturally start borrowing massive amounts of money to build physical things like factories.
Exactly. But what if investment doesn't respond to interest rates at all anymore?
It is a profound paradigm-shifting question.
Think about the modern economy. What if we are moving into a world dominated by massive tech companies or digital service businesses?
They don't need $100 million bank loans to build physical steel factories.
Yeah.
They just need a few servers and some code.
Exactly. If modern business investment suddenly stops caring about the bank's interest rate entirely, how does that completely upend everything we just learned about how we save the economy? Something for you to mull over until next time. Keep diving deep.